roughly a decade. You'll know the precise 8 years, for a very long time, and he left a strong and productive mark on the centre, and so I'm pleased to take this moment to thank him for his efforts, and now hand over to him to chair.
Thanks, John. That's very kind. I'm delighted to have the honor of introducing Denis Walsh today. A little less than a month ago, I was honored to be introduced by him at a conference he organized right at the end of his wonderful year at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Paris, a conference on life and mind, Aristotelian themes in contemporary philosophy. I've known Denis for quite some time. He has a PhD in biology from McGill University in Canada, Montreal, and a philosophy PhD from King's College London. So he's one of these doctor types that we occasionally encounter. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto and a core faculty member of the Institute for History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of Toronto. As many of you will know, he's published very widely in the philosophy of biology, with a special attention to the varieties of kinds of scientific explanations that you find in the biological sciences, and especially in evolutionary biology. In 2016, he published Organisms, Agency, and Evolution, and it's a wonderful sort of summation of a lot of the work he's been doing in this area for the last, 15 years or so at least, I think. Denis and I think, first really got to know each other at a pair of conferences in 2004 and 2005, I think. One.
No, we met on September 11th.
That's right. Oh, I forgot about that in 2001. You're right. That's right. Yeah. I was in London when the planes hit the Twin Towers, as was Sandy, as were a number of people in my department at the time. Oh, gosh.
Yeah. Sorry.
Throwing me completely off, better mind you. At any rate, the one thing that I wanted to mention is that he has recently edited a volume with Philip Huneman, Challenging the Modern Synthesis, Adaptation, Development, and Inheritance, and is looking forward to a 3-year research grant working with a number of biologists on the topic of agency in living systems. It's a topic that's near and dear to his heart, and something he's been working on a lot recently, and something we'll be hearing about today, in part, in his talk, Being Human, Being Homo Sapiens. So it's a great honor to introduce Denis Walsh.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you, John. Thank you, all of you. Can you hear me? Okay, good. So I chose this topic in part because it has a certain amount of local color. See Michael Thompson appearing here, Edouard Machery, Jim Lennox, of course, and other Pittsburgh luminaries. So also I thought it was kind of interesting. Right? So let's start with an organism. This is one of my favorite organisms. This is Elysium chlorotica. It's a nudibranch. It's not that big, and it has this amazing way of life. I should time myself again. It has this amazing way of life. So the larvae are transparent, and they settle on this green algae, this marine algae, and then they go to graze on the algae, of course, and they take the chloroplasts from the algae, and they nestle the chloroplasts in their mantle. And they also extract the nuclear DNA that controls photosynthesis in the algae, and they assimilate those, and then they take over the photosynthetic apparatus of the algae. And then, as adults, they take on this leaf-like form. And they become sessile, or somewhat sessile, and they even move towards the incident light in the way that a dicotyledon leaf would, right? So they live, as it were, as a plant thereafter. So this is a really remarkable way of life. And when we talk about this way of life, when we articulate this way of life, we have a kind of, it gives us a sense of what it is to be an Elysium chlorotica. So this conception of the Elysium way of life that I just talked about is kind of essentialist. It tells us this is what an Elysium chlorotica is or does. Is explanatory. This way of life, the way this thing goes about its daily life, explains much of its structures and functions and the integration of its structures and functions. It's individuating. It tells us why and in what respects members of the species are like one another and what differentiates them from other nudibranchs, other species. It's teleological. This way of life is something that this thing strives to do. And because it's teleological, then it introduces certain norms. There are things that an Elysium ought to do and things that it ought not to do. And we can judge an Elysium's structures and its functions and activities according to whether or not they contribute to its flourishing as an Elysium. Okay. Now here's another kind of organism. This is a Homo sapiens sapiens. This is a particularly good instance of Homo sapiens sapiens. This is Donna Strickland, who grew up in a small city in southern Ontario and subsequently went on to become, I think, only the third woman to receive the Nobel Prize in Physics. And when you consider that no nudibranch of any sex or gender has ever won that prize, it really puts this achievement into context. So when we talk about humans, especially humans like Donna Strickland, we talk about their way of life too. Humans are social beings, language users, cognizers. And we are invoking their way of life in the same way. This way of life is essentialistic, it's explanatory, individuating, teleological, and normative, just like the articulation of the Elysian way of life was. Okay, this is a kind of pre-theoretic intuition. And this kind of pre-theoretic intuition forms the ground, I guess, of a pretty substantive set of claims about human or meta-ethics, what it is to be human, what human flourishing consists in, what it is for humans to pursue the good life. So the general idea is that judgments about human nature ground our understanding of what human goodness consists in. And this human goodness is of a piece with, it's a species of the generic kind of organismal goodness, okay? So human nature is a species of organismal nature. And here's Hursthouse telling us that this is the kind of basis of this meta-ethical approach, part of the nature of biological order. So humans are part of the nature of the natural biology of living things. And Julianus says we humans are a part of the world that the sciences tell us about. And in disclosing human nature, we're doing the same, we're undertaking the same kind of intellectual exercise as disclosing Elysium nature. Okay. And so when we make claims about human goodness, then these claims are of the same sort, the same kind, about the goodness of an oak tree or the goodness of a nudibranch, right? So here's Philip of Foot saying the concept of a good human life plays the same part in determining goodness of human characteristics and operations that the concept of flourishing plays in the determination of the goodness of the plants and animals. And so she says there's no change of meaning of good between the word as it appears in good roots, as in good roots of an oak tree, and good dispositions of the human will. Okay. So Michael Thompson, of course, says that when we make these judgments about human goodness or human nature, these judgments figure in what he calls Aristotelian categoricals. So in the case of bobcats, we say the bobcats breed in spring, and these categoricals have the same kind of form, and they have the same kind of implications. They're essentialistic and tells us what it is to be a bobcat in part. They're explanatory, they're individuating, they're teleological, and because they're teleological, they introduce norms of judgments about what constitutes flourishing for a bobcat and failure to flourish. And the same thing, we make these same sorts of Aristotelian categoricals about human beings. Humans are, by their natures, rational, political, creative, just, whatever, fill out the list. And these judgments have this same form, okay? So this is a very, very appealing, I think, powerful approach to understanding the nature of human goodness, the nature of human nature. Human goodness, human nature, is a natural phenomenon in just the way that the nature of an oak tree or an Elysium chlorotica is a natural phenomenon. And in studying human nature, we're studying some natural phenomenon. Okay. So, but the question, so there are two parts to this claim. One is this, this continuity claim. These judgments are judgments of the same form. And the other is this claim, this metaphysical claim. These judgments are judgments about nature. These are natural features of the world. And so naturalized ethics has to face this challenge of, in what respect? How can we claim that these judgments are natural in this way? Well, Elysium chlorotica and oak trees are organisms. And we have a science of organisms, biology, evolutionary biology. And so the thought might be then, just as evolutionary biology underwrites these naturalness claims for the roots of oak trees or the photosynthetic abilities of an Elysium, they would justify and warrant these naturalist claims about what goes into constituting a human goodness, a good human life. And so one natural thought then is that, oh look, we should study these natural phenomena in the way that we study other natural phenomena of other organisms, and our license for making these claims comes from exactly the same source, which is to say our study of biology. So here's another Thompson, Darcy Thompson, reminding us that everything is the way it is because it got that way. And in the case of organisms, types of organisms get the way they get through the process of evolution. And so it might be natural to think that we can ground our study of human goodness in the, the claims that we're studying something natural when we study human goodness might derive from this concept of goodness having a place in our evolutionary biology. So we should look to evolutionary biology to warrant the claim that these are natural phenomena. Well, this project hasn't worked out that well. So one way of thinking of this is that if we're going to say that evolutionary biology warrants these claims or supports these claims, then this phenomenon of human goodness should fall out as a kind of consequence of our best evolutionary theory, right? And this has been a project that's been around for a while, and the trouble is that there's a kind of consensus view in philosophy of biology and biology itself that evolutionary theory grounds no such claim as there is such a thing as a human nature or an organismal nature. The concept of an organismal nature plays no part in our evolutionary biology, and so the concept of human nature as a species of this general concept should play no part either. And so early on in this debate, Michael Gislin says, well, what does evolution teach us about human nature? What does it teach us about organismal nature? It teaches us that human nature is a superstition, right? So if we're looking to evolutionary biology, we get no support whatsoever for this idea that there's a natural phenomenon, human nature. And here's David Buller in his critique of evolutionary psychology saying, look, the idea of a human universal nature is deeply antithetical to a truly evolutionary view of our species, okay? So if we're thoroughgoing evolutionary biologists, we should just let go of the idea that there's any such thing as an organismal nature. Other evolutionary biologists and philosophers of biology are a little more permissive. Here's some more quotations. Here's Kevin Leyland saying, look, the concept is more trouble than it's worth and it should just be abandoned. Just let go of the idea that there's such a thing as human nature at all. Other philosophers of biology are a little more permissive. Edouard Machony, for instance, and others say that, look, we can get something out of this concept of an organismal nature. Their species have traits in common. So, there are certain traits prevalent in population that is due to their evolutionary history, and the collection of these traits constitutes the nature of that species or of that kind, right? So here's David Hull being a little more concessive, saying, look, if by human nature all one means is a trait is to be prevalent and important for the moment, then human nature surely exists. But it's a very etiolated, thin notion. And here's John Dupre saying there's nothing more to human nature than the developmental cycles that currently constitute life. And here we are, here's Edouard saying, look, yeah, I mean, this concept of human nature is going to give us something, right? So he claims that human nature is the set of properties that humans tend to possess as a result of the evolution of their species. And despite being watered down in some respects, this notion of human nature is far from toothless. And that seems right. So it tells us that certain traits are common in human populations. So humans typically have cognition and sociality and emotions and aesthetic appreciation, moral sentiment, and they also have bipedal gait and high cephalic indices and higher order precision grip and earlobes and nobaculum. And so this human nature here, this list of properties that can ground certain conductive practices. The next person unique will probably have earlobes and probably be capable of cognition. But this is not a very contentful, robust conception of nature, or human nature. It should not be used to ground our kind of moral discourse. And so Tim Lewins is quite rightly skeptical about the idea of using this conception of human nature as anything like a ground for any kind of moral or political study of humans. Okay. One of the principal worries about thinking that human nature should be an observational consequence of evolutionary theory is that it erodes the status of ethics, right? It erodes what Michael Thompson calls the autonomy of ethics. And he says, like, the threat of biologism only holds if the concept human is an empirical and biological concept, and only if all substantive knowledge about human life form is empirical and biological knowledge. But, he claims, it isn't. And supposing that it is would turn ethics into a subdiscipline of biology. It would deny what's legitimately called the autonomy of ethics. Okay. So if this concept of human nature isn't an observational consequence of our best evolutionary theory, or it doesn't fall out as a set of predictions about from our best evolutionary theory, what's the relation between evolutionary theory and our concept of human nature? Well, Michelat says, look, we know about human nature not as scientists, but as humans, as practically wise persons. It's not an endowment from our scientific understanding. And so I'll read these in reverse order. John Hacker Wright says, look, our concept of our theory of human nature is not an empirical theory. It's a logical theory. And so we cannot look to evolutionary biology to ground the naturalist status of our study of human nature. Right. Now, does that mean that this concept of human nature is not a natural one? Well, not necessarily, as Michelat says. The fact that biologists and philosophers of biology have a different way of approaching biological teleology does not in itself show anything illegitimate about the kind of judgments that interests, say, Michael Thompson and Philippa Foot. Okay, but what does establish the natural status of this concept of human nature? Well, this is a challenge raised by Tim Lewins in his paper Footnote. He says, the onus is on the likes of Foote and Thompson, not merely to show that much discourse seems committed to normative essences, but there really are such essences. Unless such a task is achieved, they have shown only that people are intuitive Aristotelians, which is to say intuitive. They intuitively have the idea that we have this kind of normative essence, this way of being as humans that explains to us what we are. Okay. So we're intuitive intuitions, but this doesn't show that this Aristotelianism is a positive one we should adopt. It doesn't tell us that this intuition catches onto anything in the natural world. Okay. So on the one hand, we have this idea that our concept of human nature, the kind of thing we need to ground this meta-ethical study, doesn't fall out as a consequence of our best evolutionary biology, an empirical consequence. On the other hand, if we think of it as an a priori notion, we don't get the kind of warrant for its naturalistic status that we might want. Okay. But there's another option. The options aren't merely just an empirical consequence or an a priori concept. The way we naturalize lots of our scientific concepts is not by them being a priori or empirical consequences, but their indispensable role in a theory. Think of the concepts that form important parts of our theorizing, like the concept of space-time or mass or matter. These are neither a priori nor strictly empirical consequences. They earn their keep from the role they play in a theory. So maybe an alternative way of naturalizing this concept of human nature is that this concept of human nature plays this kind of role in a theory, indispensable part of the apparatus of theory. And of course, there is a wonderful, profound, powerful, comprehensive theory of biology that grounds this notion of human nature. This is Aristotle's biology. So Aristotle says, according to some person called Jim Lennox, that soul is, so Aristotle explains the form of or the structure of an organism, their activities, by appeal to soul, right? But the form of an organism. And soul is distinguished by a set of vital functions: nutrition, growth, locomotion, in the case of humans, cognition. And we may think of the form of an organism as a set of organizing principles or a set of goal-directed dispositions to organize its matter in such a way that the organism is capable of performing particular soul functions in a particular way distinctive of its kind. Now, it turns out that soul isn't going to be enough for Aristotle for various reasons. One being that soul is hierarchical. Any two organisms share a set of soul functions, and it's relative. So organisms that share a soul differ from one another by more than the last. And so Aristotle's biology needs a differentia. It needs something that will tell us why each organism of each kind resembles the others of that kind in the way they do and how they differentiate from others. And here Jim says that Aristotle appeals to four differentiae. The differences among animals are in accordance with their ways of life. He says in the History of Animals, their activities, their traits of character, and their parts. And one of these, ways of life, bios, seems to be the central concept here. So Aristotle appears to bios, the full complement of an animal's activities organized around a single goal of its specific way of life to explain the natures of organisms. Okay, what does bios explain? It explains the fit of organisms with their circumstances, with their conditions of existence. It is identifying an animal's way of life. Also points out to us the environmental context, its niche, but also crucially explains the integration and coordination of organisms. Organisms are really finely adjusted entities that work together as a unit. So bios explains the fundamental fact that each of the parts of an organism is structured so that its functions are performed in ways that implement the functions of other parts. Okay. And bios has this kind of, bios explains all these features of organisms, the function, development, behavior, integration, their fit, and the diversity of organisms. And these bios explanations have the sorts of characteristics that we expect from our way of life, or from our sort of nature explanations. They're essentialist, they're individuating, teleological, and they introduce norms. So one thought then is that the Aristotelian concept of bios would be a very, very good candidate for the naturalistic concept of an organismal way of life, of which human way of life is a specific case. And so we could ground our concept of, or human, of way of life, of human nature, in Aristotle's biology. So here, bios is a plausible candidate for the neo-Aristotelian conception of organismal nature. It earns its keep as part of the apparatus of a comprehensive scientific theory of fit diversity. The problem with this is it's a little out of date. I don't keep au courant with biology, but I think this is not how it's done these days. So that's too bad, but anyway, it's a nice try. There's a reason why that we don't do biology this way anymore, and it's because evolutionary biology, or current biology, operates without the concept of an organism at all. The concept of an organism is not part of the explanatory apparatus of evolutionary biology, for reasons being that organisms have been recast as those things that are built by genes, and genes are molecular entities. So here's another local luminary telling us that the development of, well, the molecular revolution in biology in general, but the Crick-Watson model of DNA in particular, the development and the implications of the Watson-Crick model have given us persuasive reasons for believing that biology is nothing more than chemistry. We don't need any special biological categories, but it's chemistry that's pretty fancy, right? But anyway, nothing like organismal nature is going to appear in our best biology. Okay. So what is our best biology? Well, our current best biology is basically a theory about the dynamics of populations of abstracta, populations of genes or gene types, right? And so the most powerful version of it was codified by Ronald Fisher in 1930, and it goes now under the name of the modern synthesis of evolution. And what Fisher wanted to do was he wanted to articulate a universal principle of populations. All populations, no matter what they are going to change according to certain laws, he called them, right? And the idea then is that in a population, we can divide the population up into abstract trait types, and we can assign its trait types fitnesses, and the variation in the growth of the abstract trait types will allow us to predict and quantify and explain changes in the trait structure of the population, right? So natural selection occurs when populations vary in their trait fitnesses, and populations undergoing selection spontaneously move to a fitness equilibrium, okay? So, but here's the problem. And this is a problem that Fisher himself recognized. What he's identified for us is a universal property of populations. But part of what we want to do when we're explaining the fit and diversity of organisms is explain the specific features of populations of organisms. Right? This doesn't give us an account of how one population of organisms is different from another population of organisms, right? But in explaining, but the theory of adaptation requires that. We have something, so this is a very, very complex technical problem in evolutionary biology, it turns out, but a simple way of getting into it might be something like this. So evolutionary biology has something that I can't resist calling the Anna Karenina problem, right? So Tolstoy starts by telling us all happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. What's this got to do with anything? Well, the biological version of the Anna Karenina problem is that all fit populations are alike. They operate according to these universal principles, but each adapted population is adapted in its own way. So if I ever write another book, I'm going to change my name to Walsh and start it. So evolution, just like Aristotle's theory, evolution needs a differentia. something that can explain the specific adaptations of each population or species of organisms. And as I said, Fisher recognized this. He says, but as Fisher also emphasized, the steady increase in the frequency of an allele under selection, this is what all populations do, need not invariably result in the adaptive modifications of specific forms. And so how do we get this universal principle of populations to deliver, as it were, an account of the specific adaptations of organisms' populations? Well, the differentia that evolutionary biology introduces is the environment. Populations encounter an environment, an external environment, and it's the exigencies of the environment that select those variants that are useful for surviving in it. And so Fisher himself says, well, here's what we need then. One thing, the organism is made to conform to another, the environment, in a large number of different respects. Now, notice the role that the organism is playing here. It's strictly passive. It's being molded by the environment, right? It's that on which the environment acts, or natural selection acts. Okay. And here's Peter Godfrey Smith telling us what the role of the environment is. The environment is differentia. He says, organisms respond to the environment, but the environment is largely autonomous with respect to the organisms. The environment is seen as either stable or else as changing according to its own intrinsic dynamics. And then organismal form is passively molded by the activities of the exigencies of the environment. Okay. So there's a problem with this differentia, and it's this, that the external autonomous environment is not what we need in order to explain adaptive evolution. There are a couple of reasons for this. One, it fails to capture the concept of an adaptation. And two, it fails to explain adaptive differences. More particularly, it fails to explain the dynamics of adaptive population change. So let's go through these two problems. Okay. So this is the kidney of an earthworm. This is the nephron here. And there are very, very strange things about earthworms. Is that they are descended from aquatic ancestors, but they live in terrestrial environments. And they have this aquatic excretory system, okay? So they live in the soil, but they have this, these aquatic kidneys, okay? And aquatic kidneys just shouldn't work in a terrestrial environment because an aquatic kidney and a terrestrial kidney face hugely different demands. So in an aquatic environment, there's loads of water outside the nephron, and the organism has to stop the water from getting in. And so this is actually an animation in the keynote version. And so what it does is it excretes these highly dilute wastes, right? Now, in a terrestrial environment, the kidney faces exactly the opposite problem. The organism has to stop water from escaping, right? So what does it do? It secretes these highly concentrated wastes. Okay. So an aquatic kidney should just not work in a terrestrial environment. This is just precisely the wrong thing to have. So how is it that earthworms manage to have an aquatic kidney in a terrestrial environment? Well, as you know, earthworms worm around in the earth, and they're deposit feeders. They eat the earth, and they excrete it, and they mash it up, and they macerate it, and they change its structure, and they secrete all sorts of mucus as they move through. And the consequence of this restructuring of the soil is that the soil that the earthworms leave behind or recondition has the capacity to hold free water in the interstices between its grains. And so basically, earthworms build a swimming pool for themselves as they go along. They alter their environment, so they are living in a de facto aquatic environment, even though they're in the earth. So it's the activities of the earthworm and the structures of the earthworm, their feeding, their locomotion, all these things that go into changing their environments in such a way that their parts and their functions become appropriate. Now, it's not just in cases where organisms literally change the structure of their environment where this kind of arrangement becomes relevant. Take the case of locomotion through water. So here's an adaptive problem that various organisms have solved. So here's a harbor porpoise. It's about our size. It experiences the water in the way we do. It's thin. It's a thin medium. It's easily displaced. And so harbor porpoises have evolved this nice terete shape here, and a big wide tail, and a powerful caudal peduncle there, and they manage to get laminar flow passing over the body, displacing the water that way, and they can swim, right? Because for them, water is thin, right? So here's a paramecium, about 200 microns long, in the same environment. For paramecium, the water is thick. They experience water the way we would experience being immersed in corn syrup. And so having a caudal peduncle, even if they could have one, they're single cellular things, but I mean, it would just be out of the question, right? So they have a different set of adaptations. They have these cilia in spirals here, and they all beat in unison, and they, as it were, screw the paramecium through this thick medium. Okay. So what we have here is the same environment, different adaptations. Why is it that we have the same environment and different adaptations? Because the same environment is experienced in vastly different ways between these two organisms, and the adaptations are adaptations to the experience of the environment. Okay. Now, what makes it the case that these environments are experienced differently? Well, it's the structures of the organisms, their capacities, their life activities, their purposes, the way they go about their way of life, so to speak. Okay. And so organisms make certain features of their environments salient through their way of life. There are other ways in which the same environment can offer different challenges and different opportunities for adaptation. So the thrush here and the woodpecker live, for all intents and purposes, in the same environments. And yet, as Richard Lewington has argued so many times, the rock at the base of the tree is a salient, important part of the environment of the thrush, because the thrush uses the rock to break shells on. The grubs underneath the bark are a salient feature of the environment of the woodpecker, because the woodpecker is able to get under the bark and feed on those things, but the thrush isn't. So this is no part of the thrush's environment. So organisms select that part of their environment that's salient to them. And once again, what makes these salience relations are the structures, the capacities, the life activities, and the purposes of the organism. So here's a reason why we should think that the external environment is not the differential we need, because it strictly underdetermines what it is to be an adaptation. So it doesn't explain the adaptive differences between these radically different organisms, right? Okay. So what does explain the adaptation of organisms? Well, organisms experience their environments as systems of affordances. So here's J.J. Gibson in his work on ecological perception, saying the affordances of the environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnishes, for good or for ill. I mean, by it's something that refers to both the environment and the animal. It implies the complementarity of the animal and the environment, right? Where affordances are opportunities for action. They are properties of the animal-environment system that determine what can be done. Okay. So the thought here is that if adaptation is a response to the experienced environment, and the experienced environment is a function of the structures, functions, goals, and capacities of organisms, then adaptation is a response to affordances. Okay. So, and affordances are co-constituted by the features of the environment and by the organisms themselves, by their activities, their structures, their functions. And there's a reciprocity between affordances and organisms' capacities. So as organisms respond to their affordances, they change, and therefore they change their affordances, which redounds back on organisms, provides new challenges for them. And so as organisms respond to and reconstruct their affordances. Okay. And so what goes into constructing these affordances, as I said, is this complete suite of activities, structures, and capacities of organisms. Okay. And so, right. So then we need a concept in order to explain adaptation that encompasses the complete suite of capacities, structures, goals of organisms. Now there's another reason why the environment itself, or the environment molding passive form, isn't going to give us a complete account of adaptive evolution. One has to do with the coordination that's required in development in order for novelties to occur, right? So how do we go from a situation in which we have this generalized tetrapod forelimb to this highly specialized bat forelimb? Well, every single subsystem in this limb has to change. You have to have a change in the structure of the bones, you have to have a change in the origin and insertion of muscles, the relative muscle masses, you have to have a change in the nervous system, in the circulatory system, in the integument. All these systems have to work together, okay? Now, if we had to wait around for a mutation to occur in every one of these systems, then it would never happen. It might never happen. We could never get these complex the origin of these complex adaptations occurring. But that's not how it occurs in organisms. Organisms' development is modular, and they have this capacity to, each module has a capacity to accommodate changes in the other modules, and this is the major driver of adaptive novelty, okay? So here's Finnegan now saying, in contrast to the rapid response produced by plasticity, this is the phenotypic accommodation, if the production of newly favored phenotypes requires new mutations, the waiting time for such mutations could be prohibitively long, and the risk of subsequent loss through drift could be high, okay? So phenotypic accommodation finesses this problem, according to Stirelli. A genetically caused modification in one system need not wait for a genetically caused change in an associated system, even when both must change for either to be adaptive. So the coordinated integration and orchestration of subsystems in development is a crucial part of explaining the possibility of adaptive novelty. Also, the adaptive changes are inherited across generations. So if we drought stress plants, we find that they produce greater root masses, and this capacity to produce greater root masses lasts for generations. And it can be additive over generations, and it can be, as it were, not canceled in a subsequent generation by relieving the drought pressure. So there's this intergenerational stability of this investment in root mass. And it turns out that this is as a result of adaptive methylation. So the response to stress in the cells turns off certain genes, and those genes remain turned off for many, many generations. And this is a crucial feature of adaptive evolution, this transgenerational stability. It's not genetically mediated transgenerational stability, it's adaptively acquired stability, okay? And it turns out that there's a whole panoply of these different modes of inheritance. And the crucial thing about these modes of inheritance is that they trade off the stability of a change in form with the revisability or the adaptive responsiveness of the change in form. So genetic inheritance is really, really long-lived, but not responsive at all to the dynamics of changing circumstances. But there are other modes of inheritance: epigenetic inheritance, cultural inheritance, ecological inheritance, and these are all sensitively attuned to different timescales in which circumstances can change. But the crucial thing is that all these alternative modes of inheritance are organism-mediated. They're produced by organisms as responses to their circumstances, and then the changed features of organisms that are induced, or that are brought about, are passed on across generations. And so if we only used our modern synthesis conception of genetic inheritance, we would miss out a huge chunk of what makes inheritance possible, or what makes adaptive evolution possible. Okay. So modern synthesis evolution then, construed as the molding of passive form by the environment, suffers an explanatory deficit. Okay? It can't fully account for the fit of organisms, because for that we need the concept of affordance. It can't account for the origin of complex adaptive novelties. For that we need the idea that organisms orchestrate their own development. And it can't account for the full range of kinds of intergenerational stability that adaptive evolution requires. So we need a new concept. We need to augment the modern synthesis theory of evolution with a concept of an organism as a constructor of affordances, as an adaptive entity, as a coordinator of parts and functions, as the cause, the locus of inheritance, right? So modern synthesis evolution needs to be expanded in this way, right? Now this concept, this missing concept, doesn't have a name yet. But I suggest that bios might be a good candidate. Bios is the full complement of an animal's activities, organized around the single goal of its specific way of life. Okay. So let's just suppose that's right. The bios is the, or a, missing concept from the modern synthesis theory of evolution. Now, if we incorporate bios into our understanding of the dynamics of evolution, it changes some things for us. It changes our concept of what evolution is, for instance. Under this view, evolution is of a lineage is a change in its nature or its way of life as a response to conditions that are largely created or constituted by the organism's pursuit of its way of life. So nature is not merely a consequence of evolution, it's a cause of evolution. And this will give us a way of kind of grounding our neo-Aristotelian meta-ethical view of human nature. Human nature is a species of organismal nature. And so then we can help ourselves to the idea that naturalized meta-ethics, this concept of the human nature that we need, gets its naturalistic license from the very fact that it and what ought to be our best theory of evolution share a crucial theoretical concept, that of bios, of way of life. Okay. So just as bios captures the neo-Aristotelian concept of human nature, it is also an indispensable theoretical posit in evolutionary biology. Okay. So as I said, that's where we can claim that naturalized meta-ethics, neo-Aristotelian meta-ethics, gets its naturalistic orator license. Okay, what happens next? Okay. Now, Michael Thompson early on was justifiably concerned about the subsumption of ethics under evolutionary biology. If we look to naturalize ethics by appeal to evolutionary biology, we also run the risk of, as it were, denying it its autonomy. Do we have the same problem here? Well, I don't think so, right? So, when we're just doing our meta-ethics, when we're doing meta-ethics, when we're just trying to study human nature, we're studying human natural history. And human natural history comprises the study of moral philosophy and aesthetics and sociology and psychology and anthropology, but also cognition, ethology, development, physiology, anatomy. An important point is that you don't need any evolutionary concepts to study these things. In just the same way that you don't need any evolutionary concepts to study these things either. You don't need evolutionary concepts to study the Krebs cycle. You don't need evolutionary concepts to study action potentials. Right? And you don't need evolutionary concepts to study aesthetics or moral philosophy. So evolutionary concepts are not needed to study human natural history or any natural history. Nevertheless, we should bear in mind that human natural history evolved. It's a consequence. Humans are the way they are because they got that way through the process of evolution. And so we might think then that rather than subsumption or alienation from one another, there's a reciprocity between the study of human evolution and the study of human nature. Human evolution is a change in human nature, way of life, as a response to conditions that are created, constituted by human nature. So you can't understand human evolution unless you understand something about human nature. Of course, if you want to understand something about human nature, it helps to know a little about human evolution as well. But we don't get a reduction of one to the other, a subsumption of one in the other. And so human nature and human evolution are reciprocally constituting, so we need to study them both. And so the study of human nature and the study of human evolution are also reciprocally illuminating.